In the last My Season as a United fan, we reminisced about Fergie's swan song, the title-winning 2012-13 campaign. So for this iteration, we're going back to Fergie's first effort, albeit partial effort, as he took over the reins at Old Trafford mid-season of the 86-87 campaign. It's not going to be pretty, but it should certainly evoke some memories for those like me who lived through it. I was only 9 when the season began, having supported United for just a couple of years, so the 85 Cup final win was still fresh in the memory, and I'd yet to see some real club turmoil, but everything was about to change. Just to remind you about how different football was at that time compared to today, there was no technology of course, also no back pass rule, in line was offside, and anywhere on the pitch was interfering with play. Slide tackles were legal and usually an art form. Getting any touch on the ball before the man was considered a legitimate tackle. Only one substitution was allowed per game, pitches were muddy by mid-October, and there was no such thing as transfer windows. Additionally, English clubs were into their second year of being banned from European competition after Heysel. As a result, United had to forego their UEFA Cup spot earned in the previous campaign. In order to relate to how events unfolded in this 86-87 season, we should first talk a little bit about the previous campaign. In August 1985, the club was still riding high off the back of our famous FA Cup win, but we were still 18 years without the league title. However, we won our first 10 matches that year, opening up a 10-point lead, and finally looking like regaining the First Division title. A poor second half to the season saw us not only squander that lead, handing over the title to Liverpool, but we also dropped down to 4th, even behind West Ham. It was a huge disappointment. Manager Ron Atkinson had won 2 FA Cups and a Charity Shield since his arrival in 81, but after the previous season's self-destruction, he'd let the board know that he felt like he'd taken the squad as far as he could and wanted to quit. But Chairman Martin Edwards was still convinced that he was the man for the job and encouraged him to stay on for one more try. By the time the season kicked off, there were remarkably no actual signings. Strikers Terry Gibson and Peter Davenport, as well as Danish fullback John Severbeck, had all been acquired since the new year. There was one real effort to sign an elite centre-back, Terry Butcher from Ipswich Town, but the deal fell through. Big Ron essentially would begin the season with the same squad that had come so near and were yet so far from the league title just months before. Due to the Mexico 86 World Cup, the start of the season was relatively late, with United kicking off at Highbury on the 23rd of August 1986. And talking about the World Cup, several United players returned from international duty requiring operations, including skipper Brian Robson and first choice keeper Gary Bailey. So kicking off the new season, August was an unmitigated disaster. An away match against Arsenal wasn't the best opening day fixture for Ron to get, and a late Charlie Nicholas goal meant it was going to be a losing start. West Ham visiting Old Trafford followed next, and they raced into a 2-0 lead before Frank Stapleton and Peter Davenport levelled it up either side of the interval. However, a Frank McAvenny winner, again late on, did for us as we went down 3-2. Worse was to follow in our final game of the month, an embarrassing 1-0 home defeat to New Boys Charlton Athletic. The press were having a field day, and the board was starting their pursuit of Aberdeen boss Alex Ferguson. As it literally couldn't get any worse, September was, by definition, going to be a better month, but not by a great deal. A trip to Filbert Street saw United fall behind for the 4th match in a row, but a Norman Whiteside equaliser was enough for the side's first point of the season, but they still fell a place to bottom of the league. Southampton's arrival and subsequent 5-1 drubbing was the typical false dawn that sides in this position sometimes get. Jesper Olsen's opening pen was quickly equalised, but 2 more goals either side of the break was enough to give Ron Atkinson a rare good night's sleep. His side's heady 19th place, though, wasn't going to last long. The last 3 matches in September were all defeats. A Vicarage Road to Graham Taylor's Watford, followed by a 3-1 loss to title challengers Everton at Goodison Park, but most disappointingly to Chelsea at Old Trafford, decided by a second-minute Kerry Dixon goal. Some of you may remember that we had 2 penalties in that match, with Olsen and Strachan both stepping up and squandering those chances. With that lack of mental toughness and inability to execute gilt-edged opportunities, it's not surprising that we were always the bridesmaids but never the brides in the league during Atkinson's tenure at the club. The only bright spot this month was an expected League Cup second round first leg win, 2-0 against Port Vale. The boys would finish off the job in October with a 5-2 victory in the Potteries, setting up a welcome third round home tie against Southampton, who we just pummeled at Old Trafford. This would take place in late October. Into October with his job hanging by a thread, in the league at least, this month was a veritable renaissance, with the boys going unbeaten. A credible 1-1 draw at Clough's Forest was followed by a win over Sheffield Wednesday. A narrow 1-0 win over Luton, who would end up 7th by the end of the year, was a better result than we realised at the time. The final league match of the month was a 1-1 derby draw against a poor City side, with Frank Stapleton's opener just after half-time soon being equalised by the Blues' Mick McCarthy. United ended the month languishing in 20th position. However, the foreshadowing of the boss's imminent departure came against Southampton as the side tried to salvage their season in the League Cup. This home game wasn't a repeat of the 5-1 scoreline of the previous month. Instead, it was a drab 0-0 draw, with the replay to come on the 4th of November on the South Coast. Things were now getting tetchy on the training pitch as well, possibly due to this poor run, as inexplicably, dwarfish Danish winger Jesper Olsen decided to pick a fight with hard as nails Remy Moses after a poor challenge by the England man. It didn't last long or end too well for the Dane, and Atkinson put him on the transfer list, but he'd soon be off it. Also, by the end of the month, cup-winning fullback John Gidman had left, surplus to requirements, and he joined Man City. By the start of November, things were in place to finally bring Alex Ferguson down south to become the new manager at Old Trafford. The incumbent's days were now numbered. Another disappointing draw, this time 1-1 at home to Coventry City, further demonstrated that there was little sign of Big Ron somehow being able to turn it all around. So it would be a humiliating 4-1 League Cup replay defeat that would be the final straw. Within 24 hours, Big Ron had gone, with Alex Ferguson being unveiled as the new Manchester United manager on the 6th of November 1986 on a 4-year contract. After all Ron Atkinson had done for the club, following the dour years under Dave Sexton, with instead his brand of showmanship football, great European nights and 2 FA Cups, it was hard to see him go. But it was never going to be a side that would fight for him again. It was going to be one of the most momentous turning points in United's then 108-year history. Apart from the dismal league position, already out of the running for 2 of the 3 trophies on offer, the whole club was in need of invigorating, with the facilities and even the scouting practices well below the standards required. This was not just going to be a dressing room to turn around, this was going to be a long-term project for the whole club, to bring everything up to a standard to compete with Everton and Liverpool, who between them dominated the decade. Even Man City had a better network of scouts pursuing local and northwest talent. Ferguson immediately channeled resources into this priceless conduit. Fergie was concerned about the players who were on the treatment table on a regular basis, especially Robbo, Norman Whiteside and Paul McGrath. This trickled down to the then drinking culture at the club, which was enabled by the previous regime. The imbibing of alcohol was prolonging the players' recovery time. The dour Scot quickly put a stop to it and began to monitor his players' movements. The facilities at the Cliff also needed upgrading, but first things first, getting results. Fergie took Jesper Olsen off the transfer list. It wasn't the best of starts as Oxford United, who were the newly promoted League Cup holders, inflicted a 2-0 defeat in the boss's first match at the Manor Ground on the 8th of November. A week later, the Scottish pretender to Busby's mantle earned his first point with a 0-0 draw at Carrow Road. Fergie's first win would be thanks to a goal ironically scored by Danish fullback Johnny Sieverbeck against QPR. I say ironically as, despite it being a cracker, it was going to be his only goal for the club, as the boss would get rid of him by August the next year. Regardless, it was a winner, and in the first home game of the new tenure. However, the month ended in a 1-0 defeat in South London to Wimbledon, leaving United in 17th spot, as high a position as they'd been in all season. December began with a televised cracker, a 3-0 draw against Spurs at Old Trafford. The first goal was a sublime move finished off by Big Norm, followed up by a Davenport strike latching onto a Spurs defensive error. The 3 unanswered goals saw the visitors come back to go 3-2 up, before Robbo was clattered in the box in the last minute to earn a penalty. Davenport just about converted for a brace and a point. It was back-to-back 3-0 draws for United, as it was our turn to throw away a lead, after going 3-1 up at Villa Park in the 55th minute. However, showing our defensive frailties, something that needed to be shored up, we left with just a point. Next up, and the Red Devils converted a decent performance into points, with the 2-0 home win over Leicester, before going to Anfield and claiming a 1-0 victory against defending champions Liverpool, thanks to their scourge at my hero, Big Norman Whiteside. It wasn't a turning point, but it did show that we were on the right track. Bizarrely, just a day later, on the 27th of December, we played Norwich at home, which not only saw us slump to a 1-0 defeat, but also lose skipper Brian Robson to a hamstring injury for several weeks. Playing league matches on consecutive days was something I forgot to mention in my intro, outlining how football had changed. United ended the year in 15th spot. The 4-1 victory over Newcastle on New Year's Day was not only notable for its comprehensiveness, but it also propelled Fergie's side on a run of league form that saw them go unbeaten until March. The scorers, heroes of the FA Cup victory over Everton, Stapleton, Olsen and Whiteside, would all be gone before what remained of the decade. A decent draw at Southampton was followed by a bruising encounter against Arsenal, which ended up in a 2-0 home win for us, and little Terry Gibson's only goal, a deserved strike for his battling performance in that game. I will leave a link to the extended highlights in the description. It was such a different kind of game back then. No rolling around and feigning injury after tackles that would be a minimum yellow card today. That result moved us up to 13th by the end of the month. January, of course, is synonymous with top flight sides entering the FA Cup. The FA Cup third round tie was an Old Trafford derby, the new gaffer's first. Norman Whiteside's tight finish was enough to send us through. Incidentally, 4 days after this victory, former City favourite Peter Barnes moved back across Manchester to Main Road for £20,000. When the FA Cup fourth round was drawn, any Red would have ripped your arm off for the home time we got against perennial top flight underachievers Coventry City. But on the last day of January, we fell to a scrappy Keith Houchin goal and to the eventual winners. February began with a dismal 0-0 draw at relegation fodder Charlton. They'd only survived due to a playoff replay against Leeds in May. Again, another difference back in the day. Interdivisional relegation playoffs. The 3-1 home win against Watford that came next showed how erratic we continued to be, but at least we weren't losing. 2 more draws followed to the end of the month, a decent point against Chelsea and West London, and a goalless draw against eventual champions Everton, who would go on to win their second title in 3 seasons. Again, some progression was shown. This unbeaten run had seen us go up to 12th, well clear of relegation but nothing left to play for. No cups, no Europe, just pride. A second home Manchester derby kicked off March's fixtures. A scrappy 2-0 win would contribute to our quiet neighbours' misery. They'd be relegated at the season's end. The 10th spot that those 3 points took us up to was the highest point we'd reach all season. Our next 2 matches were away days at Luton and Sheffield Wednesday. We lost them both and slumped back to 13th. However, a solid 2-0 win over Nottingham Forest, with Paul McGrath opening the scoring and Captain Marvel's 3rd goal in 4 games, claimed all 3 points. We finished March in 12th. Fergie's boys started April with revenge against Oxford, a last-minute winner from Robbo, again getting on the score sheet for a 3-2 victory. A goalless draw at West Ham and a defeat to Newcastle were remarkably followed by a 1-0 win and double over Liverpool. Birkenhead's Peter Davenport claiming a late winner at Old Trafford with just 2 minutes left to go. These kinds of results, wins over Arsenal and Liverpool twice, whilst losing or failing to score against mediocre or relegation favourites, was typical of the Atkinson era and cost us dearly in title challenges under the old boss. We didn't score in a third of our league games in this campaign. However, this kind of inconsistency would continue well into Fergie's reign and would only be put to bed when we started winning league titles. Typically, only 1 win followed that triumphant victory against the old enemy, which cemented our 11th place finish, the worst final league position we had since we came back up in the mid-70s. Before I continue, there needs to be mention of United keeper Gary Bailey, who announced his forced retirement whilst in his late 20s after suffering a niggling knee injury whilst on England duty. Bailey seems to be quite underrated by our fan base, but he was the best one I saw until we got Schmeichel in 91. Our meaningless run-in began with a draw at QPR at the end of April, followed by back-to-back humblings against Wimbledon at Old Trafford, who completed the double over us, and Fergie's biggest defeat since taking over, a 4-0 loss to cup finalist Spurs. In the next game we played their opponents Coventry and came away with a draw. At least our final match of the season was a victory, 3-1 against Villa at Old Trafford, but we were well adrift of 10th spot. Not that that's a target. Technically 11th was the top half of the league, but that was scant comfort. So that was it. The season, it all changed. Big Ron was gone and it was Fergie time, albeit it needed a few years to get going. What were your memories from the season? Let us know in the comments below and like, share and subscribe. Thank you as always for your support.